Today on Locked On Rockies, we begin looking back on the 2022 season with a reflection of three things the Colorado Rockies have to be better at next year, regardless of who's on the field.
You are Locked On Rockies, your daily Colorado Rockies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Rock on Rockies fans, welcome into the Locked On Rockies podcast for today, the 6th day of October, the first day of the offseason for the Colorado Rockies, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Well, I kind of mixed that up. I kind of scrambled my wires there. But this is the Locked On Rockies podcast, which is on the Locked On Podcast Network, and we're proud to be your first listen of the day. We are free and streaming on your favorite streaming service. Just search Locked On Rockies on wherever you get your podcast, and you'll find us. And if you also go onto the YouTube space, you hit subscribe to Locked On Rockies, you'll know when we're live on YouTube, and you can join in on the live chat. Today on Locked On Rockies, we're going to talk about three things the Colorado Rockies need to do better next year, no matter who is on the field. Before we get to that, I should introduce myself. I'm your Rockies fan extraordinaire, Paul Holden, bringing you your daily Colorado Rockies talk. Been following the team my entire life and bringing you your daily Colorado Rockies podcast for a couple of seasons now. So if you were in the live chat a second ago and we first started recording this podcast before my Roomba decided to destroy my internet connection, we were talking about the Rockies. The first thing that I'm expecting the Rockies to do more of this year, it's hitting home runs. The Rockies are a team that finished near the bottom of the league in baseball in home runs. The Rockies only hit more home runs than the Marlins, the Rays, the Royals, the A's, the Nationals, the Guardians, and the Tigers, all teams that weren't necessarily all that great on offense, most of them. I know there's some playoff teams in there, but that doesn't necessarily change the fact that the Rockies, their offense should have been better than those, especially when you factor in the fact that they do play in a hitter-friendly environment, and they also played some teams that matched up and actually finished higher than them on the home run totals. And some of these are kind of surprising when you see the Reds, the Pirates, and the Cubs all hitting more home runs than the Rockies this year. It's also surprising to see those three teams hit more home runs than the three closest teams to the Rockies, who come in tied for 22nd in home runs hit in the entire league this year. The White Sox, the Padres, and the Red Sox there. Three teams you'd expect to have better offenses, but two out of those three teams, pretty disappointing seasons. And it's one of those things that home runs are clutch. The Rockies were devoid of clutch hitting a ton this year. They often stranded runners in scoring position multiple times. And while we talked last year about the importance of spreading the field, hitting doubles, using Coors Field as a contact ballpark, it's painfully obvious how much the Rockies and in baseball in general, really for anyone, how important the home run is. Take a look at the teams that are in the playoffs and where they finished in home runs. Obviously, we noted two outliers already when you look at the playoff picture now, but the Yankees lead the league at 254. The Braves, who went on a tear at 243, arguably the best team in baseball in the second half of the year, the Atlanta Braves, them one thing of success, amount of home runs. It's a ton of them. The Brewers come in third. They just missed the playoffs and were in a race the entire year, basically. Astros, 100-plus win team, 214 home runs. I mean, that's a big difference. That's a huge gap in the number of more home runs that other teams hit versus the Rockies. Those are teams that they were able to capitalize in big situations. The Dodgers come in at number 5 at 212. The Phillies come in at 205. The Blue Jays at 7 with 200. I mean, there's a playoff team in the top 10. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have all of the playoff teams other than three of them, basically, with the outlier being the Padres, the Guardians, and the Rays all falling outside the top 10. But basically, the rest of the playoff field has found themselves in the top 10 in hitting home runs. They're incredibly important. And again, the gap is pretty massive, especially when you look from the top. It's kind of another reflection, too, of when you look at the top of the versus the bottom of the NL West. The Dodgers lost 60 games this year. The Rockies won 68 of them. It's clearly a metric that the Rockies need to be better in, and something they need to be using more of, especially in a hitter-friendly environment. Yes, they didn't have Chris Bryant, but you did bring Randall Grichuk in to hit home runs, and he was starting to do so at the end of the season and things towards the end, but it wasn't enough during the year. There wasn't really anyone with the Rockies that were hitting a lot of home runs outside of CJ Cron, and he fell off on the home runs. I mean, CJ Cron, his second half was kind of forgettable, really, as he sat at that 29 home run mark here. And then when you look at the Rockies, it's just a massive drop off with from the rest of the lineup, and they simply need to see more. It's great that McMahon gets up to 20, Grichuk does get up to 19, but I was expecting like 25 home runs from Grichuk. Charlie Blackmon at 16 that's pretty good for him. Hopefully Brendan Rodgers can start adding a little power into his bat. He as we've seen, hits really well against the Dodgers. So maybe that's going to be something. And maybe with the Rockies going up against, different types of pitching and not so much NL West pitching next year, they will see some benefits. But one thing for sure that the Rockies need to focus on when they're developing and building their hitting philosophy for next year, it's got to involve hitting more home runs. Let's keep diving into what the Rockies need to do better and see what the live chat's talking about, because I see how we have a couple of live chatters today. But before we do that, got to tell you about our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for football betting info this season. So if you want to get in on the action for tonight's Thursday night football game with our beloved Broncos taking on the Indianapolis Colts, well, why don't you head on over to betonline.net. You can find all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every single game that you can find. As always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all your sport wagering information, with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every single sport out there. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all your favorite games and events is at betonline.net, and you can do that on your mobile device or at betonline.net on your mobile or your browser, and you can see all your favorite games and events, including Major League Baseball playoffs, MMA, boxing, and golf. Like I said, betonline.net is available on your PC or your mobile device. That's betonline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. Let's head into the live chat here before we get to our next thing the Rockies need to do more of. Joel DeGray says, how many of those teams fired their managers recently? Seems relevant. Interesting point. When you look at that, the Phillies fired their manager. I don't think the Braves didn't fire their manager, but certainly the Phillies one being the most interesting one there. Let's see. The Angels as well, cracking, getting up in there. It's pretty amazing, though, when you look at the Angels, how many of their 190 home runs came from just two people, including Trout, who was mostly gone. But you are right. There are a couple of teams, when you are looking at it, they are had a couple of managers that were let go. But again, don't hold your breath. Bud Black ain't going anywhere. Just to circle back, one big reason why the Orioles were as successful as they were a middle of the road, middle of the pack team when it came to home runs. They were a team that was, just outside, I say just, but about 19 or so home runs from being outside of the top 10 in or tied with LA for 11th in baseball in home runs. But there's your key point there about the importance of home runs. How big in those games where clutch home runs from Orioles hitting, that's what you need to do. And that's how you know your offense is kind of working, is when the team is seeing the ball well enough to drive it out of the yard. Eric Harper says, cheers to the future. I'm with you. And thank you. The Royals did just fire their manager as well. at the bottom. And you're right too. When you look at these teams on the bottom, who's going to fire their managers? The Marlins are moving on. The Athletics, I can't remember if the Athletics did anything, but the Tigers certainly will be reevaluated. Tito's going nowhere. Same with the Rays because they're both playoff teams, and that's kind of what they do. But I'm sure the Guardians aren't very happy with that 127 home run number. Home runs are important, but what else is important for the Rockies to do more of here? As Joel DeGray says, I honestly had high hopes for Grichuk. I hoped his slugging would outweigh how much his thigh-high socks bugged me at first. That's pretty funny. I'm not out on Grichuk yet, but Grichuk does just complicate the outfield situation. Grichuk was putting the ball out of the yard, doing what he was doing last year a little bit, and is someone that finished with a higher batting average than CJ Cron and Ryan McMahon. His OPS was, in the mid 700s as well. When you look at it, he was one of the better contributors of the Rockies offense this year, even though I had some more hopes from him as well. The other thing the Rockies need to be better at next year, and one player was already really good at it this year, and another player was incredibly disappointing, at least to start the year off, and then started turning around. The Rockies can't start the year like they did playing defense the way they did. The Rockies cost themselves a lot of close, important ball games. One thing that's critical for the Colorado Rockies is to have a really good or the best first 2 months of the season that you can. We've seen historically this team struggle, but when you can build up enough cushion, and they even built a big enough one up that they bought themselves enough time, bought themselves a while of over 500 baseball for a bit. But when you're throwing the ball all over the yard, when your third baseman, the one that you re-signed, and a big part of that is to be the one that steals the Gold Glove away from Nolan Arenado, that should have gotten a Gold Glove in 2021. You need more from all of your defense. The Rockies need better defense in the outfield as well. We've seen some good defense. We've seen some diving plays, and we've seen the Rockies, make some big plays. But the Rockies have a history of good defensive baseball, and that really wasn't on display this year outside of Brendan Rodgers being being the best defensive second baseman in all of baseball this year, or at least in the National League when it comes to, I believe, wins above replacement on the defensive side. You backing up your pitchers with good defense, not allowing any of your opponents, especially your division opponents that have dominated you for so long, any extra opportunities is pivotal for the Rockies. They can't afford to allow the Dodgers to get themselves back into games because they can't play defense. They need to be able to negate some of the offensive increase that teams see at Coors Field by having good defense. We've talked about the importance of center field. Jonathan Daza played it pretty well. It's not great, but the Rockies need really elite outfield defense play as well as having a great infield, because it really impacts how teams can handle going up against the Rockies in their own environment. If the Rockies are able to negate some of the increased offense teams see at home by relying and having good defense, that's going to be another part of what's been successful. Why were the Rockies so good to make it to the playoffs? It's because their infield was nasty. They had an infield that was really, really good. They had an infield that had some of the best defenders in baseball and were eliminating things. When you have people that can't play first base, when you are overthrowing, when you have Ryan McMahon struggling and having more errors in the first half of the season than he did in the entirety of the 2021 season, those are issues. It's a glaring one to see the Rockies struggle on defense so much when the Rockies have historically been really good on defense. Yeah, it was quite the surprise to me to see that the Rockies this year were not as good as a defending team as they should have been. And I just think that this is something that when they're clicking, it's good defense mixed with clutch hitting. And like we just talked about, it was just something we didn't see a lot of. And honestly, Ryan McMahon, I have higher hopes and expectations when I'm evaluating him as a player on his defense than I am his offense. And when we look at Ryan McMahon this year, when it comes to errors and defensive play, he was still pretty darn good for the Rockies this year, and he definitely turned it around. But when we're looking at his errors in this season, 17 errors in this at second base, or I'm sorry, at third base for McMahon this season versus playing third, 5 errors there in 2021. I mean, that is and then he had 2 more errors to basically commit 10 more errors this year. Ryan McMahon having 10 more instances where he should have gotten an out or should have impacted. And how many of those instances cost runs, whether that be immediately and runs were scoring on that play, or it set up a run scoring opportunity for the other team. It's something that the Rockies can't afford Ryan McMahon to bound or to go that far back in defense. He went from a 979 fielding percentage at third base in 2021 to a 953. That's a decrease, especially when you look at it. There might be something to say the third base might be where he struggles a little bit more, but he's still been elite this whole time. He should, like we said, he should have been a Gold Glover last year, and I hope that Ryan McMahon can recreate that, because it is incredibly, incredibly important for the Rockies that Ryan McMahon is a better defensive player next year than he is, because him and mixed with Brendan Rodgers, and then of course Tovar is supposed to be really good at defense as well. The Rockies should have the foundation for another really solid left side of the infield when you're also working with and getting, Tolia ready to play first base over there, being taught by Todd Helton and such. Where does Luis Montero fit into all this? Rockies are going to have to figure that out too. But good defense is paramount for the Rockies next year. One more thing that the Rockies need to do more of next year, and it's something I think we've talked about before, but it's something that I'd love to see the Rockies do, and we talked about it. And some teams did this a lot. Some teams didn't do it a whole lot, and the Rockies were one of them. And I think it's something that they need to get a lot better at and utilize, especially with some of the members on their team. But before we get to that, check this out. We're streaming live on Locked On Rockies on YouTube. If you want to check us out, you can subscribe to Locked On Rockies on YouTube and be notified when we go live, and pop into the live chat, be part of the show, just like Joel DeGrace and Eric Harper have been today. And we've been talking about the 3 things that no matter who's on the roster next year, we're not even talking about players at this point, what the Rockies need to improve on. It's hitting home runs, it's playing better defense, and this last one is the Rockies need to steal more bases. Stolen bases are something that more teams need to do more of, and I know it's probably harder, especially as pitchers are even better, and there's all these, there's the different rules and these stuff, and there's great catchers out there. But for the Texas Rangers to lead baseball with 128 stolen bases and the Rockies to come in second to last with 45, you cannot be that far behind in a statistical category. And the Rockies have speed. They don't have as much speed, and they lost one of their biggest speedsters, but the Rockies have a decent amount of speed on their roster and should be using the steal more often. I think putting runners on, using even if you got runners moving in something like a hit and run or things of that nature, it's something that you have to be more willing to do. It's the Rockies should just be more aggressive. If they're if you can be aggressive on the base paths and make every hit the possibility of stretching it into something where you can immediately get a runners on threat by you hit a single at Coors, then the base running threat's going to be there, and you might go nab a base, and it's immediately runner on second in the bottom of the first, no outs for the Rockies. Those are the type of opportunities you can generate for yourself when you are more aggressive on the base path, when you're more willing to go and nab bases. It's something that can really help your team. And I don't think it's necessarily the most important thing, because if you look at some of the team, how we're comparing teams that do a lot of this, how does that translate into success, overall success, being the best success being the playoffs? The Rangers, the Marlins, the Cubs, the Diamondbacks, the Royals, all in the top 10, not in the playoffs. But a big shift from the philosophy, like we were talking about here, compared when we were talking about the Guardians at the beginning of the show. The Guardians might be bottom of the barrel in home runs, but they're third in stolen bases. They're creating opportunities for themselves to score without having to rely on the long ball because they're willing to go out and steal bases and get runners and put them in scoring position. And all you need to do is, if you're utilizing speed and have speed on your team, put the ball in play and good things are going to happen. You're going to be able to score more frequently when you're putting your runners in scoring position and being more aggressive. You're keeping your team more in the game. You're being constantly a threat, a multi-dimensional threat of your offense. Not only does the pitcher need to worry about handling the batter, same with the catcher, but now the whole defense has to be ready for steals and aggression on that side, which adds in a whole nother wrinkle. Take out the shift next year and things of that nature. How is that going to impact some of these stolen base numbers? It might go back to some traditional base stealing stuff. We'll see how that goes. But for me, something the Rockies really need to embrace next year is being more aggressive on the base paths. When you're looking at teams that did make the playoffs outside of the Guardians that also stole a lot of bases, Guardians at 119 stolen bases of the season, Phillies with 105, Yankees 102, the Dodgers at 98, and the Cardinals here 95 outside, but the Rays also there at 95. So again, you see a big shift in philosophy when you're looking at how the Rays and the Guardians approach their offense this year, and it's working for them based on the makeup of their team. Obviously, how the Rockies build their team and what the roster is constructed and who's made the roster and things of that nature are going to play in a big role into how the Rockies are going to be able to handle these three categories. But I just believe that the Rockies, you just don't want to be at the bottom. And being at the bottom of those two categories and with really committing a lot of errors this year, the Rockies can really benefit to improving in those areas. Folks, that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Rockies. Thank you all so much for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. Thanks to Joel, to Grace, and Eric Harper for checking us out on the live chat today. If you like the show, make sure you find us on your favorite streaming service and tune in there. Leave a review, subscribe, all that good stuff. It helps us out tremendously when you leave those reviews and when you subscribe to Locked On Rockies on YouTube. And now that you made us your first listen of the day, why don't you go check out Sully breaking down all things baseball with the Locked On MLB podcast for your second listen of the day. You can also stay up to date with the Locked On Nuggets, Locked On Broncos, and Locked On Avalanche podcast, keeping you up to date with all things Colorado sports. And follow me at Paul Holden 33. Follow the show at LO Rockies. And until next time, I'm Paul Holden saying so long from the Locked On Rockies podcast.